Staley stole my shoelace and rubbed it in his armpit, and that's not all. You know what else he did? He took my mashed potatoes and he lumped them on a spoon, then he threw them across the room. He's not a nice kid. He never does his homework. I've never seen him read. He always takes my book bag and he says it's his. I know he's lying when he says he's smarter than my grandfather, 'cause nobody is. Stanley stole my shoelace and rubbed it in his armpit, and that's not all. You know what else he did? He took my mashed potatoes and he lumped them on a spoon, then he threw them across the room. He's not a nice kid. He tried to grab a pencil and break it in two, so I filled his lunchbox up with salt. And that's the reason I was sent to the office. As you can see, it wasn't my fault. Stanley stole my shoelace.
Where did you run to a
I think that was just one of those songs about where blame lies, accepting responsibility. It wasn't my fault. You know, it's a fun thing for me to hear, because I haven't heard that one in a while. In the 90s, about 20 years after I had recorded my original albums, I had a chance to go back into the studio with a budget this time and re-record my songs and make some minor changes. Humor changes over time, sensibilities change, things that were funny in the 70s weren't really funny anymore. And I had re-recorded a lot of my songs. And then about 10 years later, my kids are going off to college, and my daughter discovered this batch of songs that she'd never heard of. She said, well, how come? What's wrong with the song? How come you never play this one? And I said, I don't like the way it starts. I don't like the last part. I don't like the middle part. And she finally said, well, wait a minute. You spend your whole life going into schools, talking to kids about the writing process. When I go into schools, I'm really brought in as a visiting author, talking about how I write, where I get ideas, the rough draft process. She said, why don't you take all your failures? Why don't you take all your worst songs and see if you can rewrite them into something that you like.
Yeah.
And so she threw down this mantle as she was going off to school, and so that song is on this album called Old Enough to Know Better, the worst of Barry Louis Polisar. And it really is my worst songs. I took the 40 songs I considered my failures, and I rewrote them and turned them into new pieces. And I joke that it's a double CD because I wrote so many bad songs back then.
Well, one of them is one of those songs that goes both ways. It can be said to be cruel, but on the other hand, kids would react to this well. If you have a kid who complains all the time, the title refers to parents.
Right.
But if I was a kid, this one would make me fall on the floor. Let's hear some of it. This one is one of your failures.
Well, it is one of my failures, yes.
If you had a kid who complains all the time.
If you have a kid who complains all the time, hollers and pouts and cries and whines, screams and stomps his feet all day, don't be angry, give him away. Don't be angry, give him away.
Follow my advice and you will see things will be better than you'd ever believe. You don't have to worry when he's immature. Who needs understanding this works for sure? Who needs understanding this works for sure? Your little brother isn't very good and won't do a thing that a good boy should. I've got a thing that'll set that right.
Lock him in a box and he's out of sight. Lock him in a box and he's out of sight.
If you have a sister who's a nasty brat, don't tell her little girl shouldn't act like that. My method is simple to understand. Package her securely and ship her to Iran. Package her securely and ship her to Iran.
And of course, that was originally written. That song was originally written right after the revolution in Iran in the late 70s, and so there was that whole issue of women's rights in that country. You really are playing my worst songs. I want you to know you really are playing the ones I consider my failures.
I have a nose for that. Seriously, though, especially when you're advocating locking kids in boxes and giving them away and sending them to Iran, do you ever have parents who just can't stand it? They say,
yes, absolutely. And first of all, clearly I am not advocating that. I mean, the idea of who needs understanding, this works for sure, is meant obviously sarcastically, sardonically, ironically. But no, there's always, throughout my career, there's always been people who just don't realize I'm kidding or don't get it. I think the last time I was on your radio show was when a school district actually tried to have my work banned in schools about almost 20 years ago. Quickly overturned. It wasn't successful. But I'll tell you, if I was just starting out in as a writer, I think it would have been successful. I think what saved me was that people knew my work. I had 15 years where people knew my material and were familiar with it and said, "Wait a minute, he's not being serious about this. He's being playful. He's being joking." Now, that's the tricky thing about humor. What some people think is funny isn't what other people think is funny.
Yeah.
And when I referred to rewriting my songs earlier, a lot of things that I wrote in the 70s, one of my favorite songs is called Our Dog Bernard, and it's about a dog who runs away. And in the original version, there's a line, "He ran off with the milkman. He's living with him now, I hear. Spends all his time in darkened barrooms, smoking cigarettes and drinking beer." And back in the 70s when I wrote that, everybody laughed at that line. They said, "Oh, he's going to the dogs. It's a figurative vision of him, really going downhill." But now, when you talk about that, there's a whole issue of substance abuse. That's no longer funny, and that I think is the case with a lot of records and movies and things that were made in that era. Humor does change. So now I have Bernard running off with a bus driver and watching TV all the time and sitting around the house getting fat and eating donuts. I mean, it's the same idea, but it's sort of a more updated version of that.
Have you had run-ins with the PC police as political correctness has increased over the years?
Much more with the PC police than, say, somebody objecting to something on a conservative point of view.
You are probably the least politically conscious person I have ever heard sing. You just don't seem to care. in fact, if you can jab the needle into political correctness,
I do care. I do care. I think that I think it goes back to what I said before. When I began, I was reading recently about some of these performing artists, whether it's an actor or a musician, when they start out, they sort of don't care because they're artists. And then they get established, and then they have to sort of watch their backs. And then they reach a point where they've been successful enough that they go back to where they started. They're okay. And that's sort of the spot that I'm at. I wouldn't say that I don't care because I certainly don't want to be flippant. I certainly don't want to be irresponsible in the way that I write. But at the same time, humor trumps it all. And if I think something is funny and I think something is witty and smart, I will become edgy. I've got an example if I can play you a song. Now this is one that I do a lot in the schools. I sort of introduce it, and it's sort of a long introduction in the schools, but I describe it as a monster song, but a monster song I wrote about my children when they were younger. And it goes like this. Be careful. It will get you if you don't watch out. It will make you scream and holler,
Make you cry and moan and pout.
It's mean and it's nasty. It's ugly and it's red. It comes when you are sleeping alone in your bed. It's Diaper Rash! It's Diaper Rash! And it, of course, becomes a song about diaper rash. Now, there's nothing funny about diaper rash, but the song is very funny. And when I do it in the schools, I mean, the kids are just literally rolling in the aisles, falling off their chairs. It's unexpected. It comes out of left field. But then I sort of talk about how the song evolved, and it really evolved very organically. I was home with my kids when they were little, taking care of them. Changing my son's diaper one day, I said, I need to change your diaper so you don't get diaper rash. And the next thing I knew, I was writing that song. So most of my songs come out of a real natural experiences that I've had. And I think that's what also works to make them popular with parents, kids, and teachers, because I'm writing about the everyday things, being compared to the boy that lived next door, or the mean teacher, or the nagging brother and sister.
Our guest is Louis Polisar. We're talking about his work over several generations almost now. We're making you a senior citizen here.
What?
And we're going to hear more of his music and his stuff in just a moment. In fact, we're going to hear about one of the issues that most kids are afraid of, but you make it light, and that's fear of being replaced.